In 1955, Hugh MacDiarmid published In Memoriam James Joyce, a 5,000-line poem that he had been working on since the early 1930s. The poem has a somewhat ambiguous subtitle, From a Vision of World Language. On one level, we might take this to mean that In Memoriam was intended to be part of an even longer work titled A Vision of World Language. But as with many of MacDiarmid's proposed megapoems, this work failed to materialise. But we can still read the title on its own terms. Is In Memoriam intended to be a sort of prospectus for what a world language might be, or instead is it an explicit example of that world language presented on the page? In this paper, I argue that MacDiarmid's vision of world language is intimately connected with what I refer to as his citational poetics. That is the way in which MacDiarmid takes material from pre-existing texts, usually but not always written by a third party, before transforming that material in some way and then combining all of these transformed fragments within the body of his own work. This is a controversial technique and one which invites and has received accusations of plagiarism. However, I show how Marilyn Randall's work on what she terms pragmatic plagiarism can be used to sidestep this debate and to focus instead on MacDiarmid's use of citation as a specific and deliberate literary technique. I argue that MacDiarmid develops these poetics in response to his perception of a set of historical developments that are each related to the changing status of English as a global language. In this sense, rather than being seen as representing a break from MacDiarmid's earlier work in Scots, In Memoriam can be seen as a development of the ideas MacDiarmid outlines in his 1931 essay, English Ascendancy in British Literature, a development that emerges from an identification of the spread of English in Britain and Ireland with the later international ascendancy of English to become the global language. My understanding of global English follows the work of the sociologist Abraham de Swan and the linguist David Crystal. So de Swan shows how 98% of languages are peripheral. Together, these thousands of languages are used by less than 10% of humankind. And two speakers of different peripheral languages will tend to communicate via a third central language. These are in turn connected by 12 supercentral languages. And above the supercentral languages, though, is only one hypercentral language that connects these languages below it, and that's English, which is the sole language of global communication in de Swan's term. David Crystal's work, on the other hand, is concerned with the historical context within which English has achieved its particular hypercentral position and its resulting unique status as a global language. On one hand, Crystal contends that the rise of English as a specifically global language, as opposed to a merely international one, largely took place in the second half of the 20th century. However, he's clear that the rise of a global language was specifically predicated on the economic globalization of the 19th and 20th centuries, which was itself supported by the new communication technologies, telegraph, telephone, and radio, and which led in turn to an explosion of international marketing and advertising and unprecedented levels of power for firstly the press and then for the broadcast media. As for In Memoriam itself, responses to the text's alleged plagiarism tend to fall into one of two camps. A reader who becomes aware of the techniques that MacDiarmid has used in his work might perceive that work to be of reduced or even no literary value. Alternatively, a reader might view the work MacDiarmid has done in selecting and transforming his source materials as constituting some form of originality. Although in this sense, the provenance of the words on the page is immaterial to the text's literary value. Marilyn Randall's understanding of plagiarism differs from all of these positions in the way that it actively engages with what Randall terms textual repetition and then teases out the theoretical implications of that practice. Indeed, Randall observes that plagiarism is not an immanent feature of texts, but is instead the interpretation of this textual repetition within a set of what she terms social, political, aesthetic, and cultural norms and presuppositions. An interpretation that can cause potentially plagiaristic texts to be considered great works of art, or to lead to their creators being censured and condemned. She then goes on to develop two theoretical implications of this approach, each of which is relevant to a different aspect of In Memoriam citational poetics. Randall's first observation is that plagiarism necessarily entails the idea of propriety and therefore implies the existence of authorship, and has done so both at a time when the modern notion of authorship did not yet exist, and recently when it appears no longer to exist within its traditional contours. Drawing on Michel Foucault's concept of the author function, Randall points out that scientific discourse is specifically characterized by the way in which it is not endowed with the author function. But that this was not always the case. Indeed, Foucault observes that while texts that we now call scientific were only considered truthful during the Middle Ages if the name of the author was indicated, following the disciplinary specialization that took place in the 17th and 18th century, scientific texts were accepted on their own merits and positioned within an anonymous and coherent conceptual system of established truths and methods of verification. The role of the author disappears as an index of truthfulness. On the other hand, argues Foucault, literary discourse was acceptable only if it carries an author's name. The second way in which Randall develops the theoretical implications of textual repetition provides a framework within which in memoriam citational poetics can be connected with global English and with the colonial histories that underpin that phenomenon. Randall traces the history of the metaphors used to describe plagiarism and observes that while plagiarism has continuously been seen as a form of conquest, conquest has not historically always been seen in the same ethical light. The way in which a society views conquest therefore goes some way to determining how it views plagiarism. And Randall argues that historically, these were both terms of positive connotations in which the political dominance of foreign territories was accompanied by the civilizing effects of the foreign culture on one's own linguistic and cultural identity, such as with the Latin conquest of Greece and the European cultural conquest of the ancients. Indeed, Randall observes that from the time of the Roman conquest of Greece, the importation of the foreign culture was an extension of the imperial victory, and contrasts this with the way in which later European colonization established the hierarchy of the civilized conqueror over the savage conquered in the imposition of a culture/language on the other. Modernity and globalization then complicate these ideas further, with conquest and colonialism becoming euphemized by metaphors such as free trade. At the same time, the conquest metaphor is retained in order to condemn plagiarism. Randall observes that accusations of cultural imperialism challenge the right of an author to appropriate material from one cultural context into another and defend the authenticity of voice in cultural expression. In this new context, Randall argues that plagiarism can in fact be deployed as a positive antidote to the evils of cultural imperialism that extends to offer a general critique of power and property in diverse contexts. Randall describes this new form of textual repetition as guerilla plagiarism, a technique that is deployed by the post-romantic appropriative artist, even though they are aware that this is not the proper way to be creative. Randall goes on to frame this within the work of Jean Baudrillard, Linda Hutcheon, and Frederick Jameson. So my contention here is that MacDiarmid's citational poetics are an instance of this guerrilla plagiarism that is developed in response to the changing status of English as a global language. But how does this connect with MacDiarmid's development of his own vision of world language? Well, we can answer this question in two ways. Firstly, with reference to what MacDiarmid himself took world language or world literature to mean, which we can establish via MacDiarmid's stated views on the subject. And secondly, by reading those sections of In Memoriam that can be taken as referring to global English. So MacDiarmid develops his understanding then of world literature in part as a response to the way he perceives poetics to have been problematized by technological modernity. This perception can be identified in multiple essays that MacDiarmid published throughout his career, but it is outlined most fully in an interview that MacDiarmid gave to Duncan Glenn in 1968. In that interview, MacDiarmid argues that the whole atmosphere of modern life, particularly urban life, has no past. There's no analogue in the past at all to the present state of what MacDiarmid terms over-scientification, a state that most of us still try to interpret in terms of a philosophy or an idea of life and so on that was itself pre-scientific. MacDiarmid goes on to outline how, while modernity generates multiple specialized disciplines and narratives, it is not clear as to who is going to arbitrate between the different explanations. His answer, however, is unequivocal. It is the poet only who will arbitrate. Elsewhere in MacDiarmid's prose output, a three-part framework can be discerned for the new poetry that might emerge as part of this proposed poetic revival. This new poetry will be heroic, epic, or put most simply just long, and it will also incorporate scientific discourse. But most relevant to my focus here is the way in which the arbiter poet should produce world literature. MacDiarmid's understanding of this term in his later prose brings together Goethe's idea of a literature of all times and languages that illustrates the idea of the unity of all mankind, and the extensive historical literary compendium of the interacting influences in literature among nations of Maxim Gorky. And it can be traced, moreover, back to 1927, where MacDiarmid's first use of the term as a world literature occurs in Albin, in the context of modernist language renewal. This in turn connects MacDiarmid's understanding of world literature back to ideas expressed in his 1923 essay, A Theory of Scots Letters, and the work of Joyce, Lawrence, Proust, and Dostoevsky. Indeed, this connection is maintained in the author's note to In Memoriam, when MacDiarmid argues that a world literature, one that assumes that the world is an indivisible unit, and which takes planetary life as its subject, has emerged in the form of the modernisms of The Wasteland, Finnegan's Wake, and the Cantos. This understanding of world literature provides a framework within which we can read three passages from the first section of In Memoriam, in each of which the text speaker opposes ideas that can be identified as being related to global English with a new poetics that has many of the features of this world literature. So while In Memoriam is in large part constructed from unacknowledged covert citations, its opening 14 lines here are made up almost exclusively of a long citation that is not only set off from the text by quotation marks, but is coupled with, indeed preceded by, an author title citation. The source here is A.G. Pape's 1928 novel, The Politics of the Aryan Road, which MacDiarmid subjects to minimal edits. The exception to this is the first line of the citation: English is destined to become the universal language. MacDiarmid seems to have based it on the two lines in the novel that immediately follow the material he quotes in the rest of his citation. Finally, I understand that a developed form of English is to be the future world language. The universal language, referred to in In Memoriam's third line, therefore originates as a world language. In other words, Pape is discussing the concept that would come to be referred to as global English, and is doing so by using the same terminology that MacDiarmid then chose to use in the subtitle of In Memoriam, A Vision of World Language. The speaker of In Memoriam mocks the idea of English taking up this role, reminding their interlocutor how the idea had caused them to laugh like hell. They then follow the quotation from Pape by suggesting a different model for a universal or world language. The I of the speaker and the you of their interlocutor is replaced by an as yet unspecified we. We who are concerned with the living whole of all the poetry that has ever been written, and the Sodalicis ad stricti consortes of all the authors who have been, are, or will be. The text does not provide a source for the overt citation in the first two lines, but much of In Memoriam's readership could be expected to identify it as having originated from tradition and the individual talent, specifically the idea that Eliot refers to as the mind of Europe. MacDiarmid splices this idea with the Sodalicis ad stricti consortes, a phrase which he very likely takes from Henri Hubert's 1934 work, The Greatness and Decline of the Celts, and which describes the Druidic brotherhood that performed a range of socio-cultural functions across the Celtic world. The speaker of In Memoriam expands on what this model might constitute over the subsequent pages of this section of the text, seeming to count amongst its antecedents the work of minority language poets such as Verdigauer and Mistral, as well as Charles Doughty, Richard Stanihurst, John Davidson, Stephen Spender, and MacDiarmid himself, identified in this instance with the speaker and his Ecclefechan Gongorism. And in the context of the explicit references to world literature in MacDiarmid's prose work, we can perhaps assume that these writers represent an extension of a set of modernist writers, Joyce, Lawrence, Proust, and Dostoevsky, etc. MacDiarmid had referred to in A Theory of Scots Letters, an essay that was broadly contemporary with tradition and the individual talent. At the same time as it outlines this modernist minority language hybrid model of world language, In Memoriam tacitly describes the historical evolution of language from spoken language through the idea of song and onto written language, and then finally to language that is broadcast. The foil for the speaker's new world language is now the language of radio, or more precisely, those radio variety programs that in fact have no variety and are instead anxious, mechanical, and cut to pattern, and made up of content that appears to be mass-produced or stenciled. And while this language is English, it is not a standard instance of either American English or British English. Instead, it is a variety of English that imitates American English, with accents that are described alternately as pseudo-American accents, some odd approximation to the accents of Michigan or Arkansas, and higher chum accents. This echoes the way in which global English developed during the 20th century in parallel with the development of the United States as a global superpower, and facilitated by the popularization of radio broadcasting, a technological development that was especially important in this context, as while literacy in the UK and the US was close to 100% when MacDiarmid began working on In Memoriam, global literacy was only around 1/3, rising to around 60% by the 1960s. In Memoriam explicitly presents itself as a response to this Americanized radio English. So these 9 lines here make use of 6 European languages to describe In Memoriam, a poem whose uniqueness leads it to be referred to as a hapax legomenon. Other aspects of the description suggest that In Memoriam is intended as a game or entertainment, and it alludes to its citational poetics by suggesting that the text is generated through the arrangement of cast-offs, and is an example of poetic scordatura, a musical term that describes the non-standard tuning of an instrument. Schablone is a German word that translates to stencil or template, and which has figurative meanings that are associated with routine, cliche, and stereotyped thinking. It therefore calls back ironically to the mass-produced stenciled popular broadcasts. With this connection established, scordatura suggests a pun on the retuning of a musical instrument and the retuning of a radio. In Memoriam expands on its proposed world language again towards the end of its first section, reinforcing the connections between this world language and the text citational poetics. Here, the foil for that world language is not English as it exists, as in the quotation from Pape at the start of the section, nor Americanized radio English, but with basic English, the simplified version of the language developed to serve as an international medium of communication. The speaker of In Memoriam contends that basic betrays, or rather displays, the magnificent insularity which is the pride of the Anglo-Saxon mind, and goes on to argue that the adoption of English as the supranational language would imply the acknowledgement of Anglo-Saxon supremacy. Instead, an auxiliary language must be clear from any threat to the economic, moral, cultural, social, or political status of any person or any people. Moreover, it must carry no implications of intellectual, technological, or other domination. The speaker concludes that all dreams of imperialism must be exorcised, including linguistic imperialism, which sums up all the rest. So the immediate suggestion in these lines is that the needs of the modern international community would be better served by a multilingual constructed language, such as Esperanto or Interlingua. But the scope of the world language proposed here is not limited to a general multilingualism derived from the vast international vocabulary. The repetition of the term imperialism calls back to the only other use of this term in the first section of In Memoriam, around 50 lines earlier. Here, the response to imperialisms is not constructed from the vast international vocabulary, but at the intersection of fusion point between science and art. And the speaker expands on this in 2 subsequent passages where they describe, first of all, a language, a poetry that is in keeping with the new quantum mechanics, and a poetry in keeping with the human nervous system. In these passages, the speaker segues from describing a language to describing a poetry, thereby closing the gap between the world language that is referred to in Memoriam subtitle and the world literature MacDiarmid refers to elsewhere. The world language suggested in Memoriam subtitle is not simply a means of communication intended to displace global English, but a poetry, indeed a poetics, created in response to globalized modernity and its social, political, and technological roots and effects. This poetics is, of course, intended to be multilingual, but it is also interdisciplinary and generalist in the way that it draws on scientific sources. A necessary feature in any poetics that is attempting to respond to the linguistic and cultural needs of a world whose interconnectedness has been determined and driven by science and technology. But how can this world language or world poetics be realized? And is in memoriam best thought of as the realization of those poetics, or a schema that outlines how they might be realized? Well, it's difficult to imagine any individual who'd be able to write in this language. Indeed, in Poetry and Virtual Realities, Edwin Morgan has contended that works such as In Memoriam reveals what was quixotic about MacDiarmid's ambition, that no single mind in the 20th century could have a grasp of the sum of knowledge as Lucretius and Leonardo da Vinci have had in their times. And from a linguistic point of view, at least, MacDiarmid seems not even to attempt this. Indeed, while In Memoriam's subject matter is often obscure and sometimes arcane, the linguistic presentation of this subject matter is, generally speaking, lucid and easily intelligible. A reader might find it beneficial to cross-reference the text with the source materials MacDiarmid used in its composition, or to look up some of the more obscure proper names. But to fluent readers of English, much of In Memoriam James Joyce is largely comprehensible in a way that the Scots lyrics or A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle might not be without access to a glossary of Scots terms, or On a Raised Beach might not be without access to Chambers' 20th century dictionary. Impossible to realise literally, MacDiarmid's world language is realised figuratively through In Memoriam's multilingual constructed language, through In Memoriam citational poetics. The bringing together of a multiplicity of voices within the text echoes both the multilingual constructed language aspect of the world language and also the multidisciplinary generalist inclusion of scientific discourse. In this reading, MacDiarmid's use of citation becomes a practical tool developed to solve the problems that are inherent in developing a language and a poetry that are intended to compete with global English. But read in the context of Marilyn Randall's work on what she terms pragmatic plagiarism, MacDiarmid's citational poetics can also be seen to have theoretical implications that relate to both the colonialism that underpinned the development of global English and the scientific discourse with which both global English and MacDiarmid's citational poetics are connected. At times, MacDiarmid's insistence that a new world language must incorporate scientific discourse seems to speak directly to Randall's reading of Foucault and the way in which authorship, itself called into question by the compositional techniques that underpin In Memoriam James Joyce, functions differently within scientific and literary texts. Thanks very much.